Hello, welcome back to our first lecture on the native groups. I wanted to start with this graphic here. Kind of silly, but I do want you to remember the three main crops of Mesoamerica, which are corn, beans, and squash. And these three crops would be grown all together in the same spot. You can see the corn is growing upright, there are beans growing up the stalk, and then the squash is at the base. And so this method is called the Three Sisters method. So remember there are three important ones: corn, beans, and squash. So you will want to remember that. All right, moving right along. Another group I want to talk about are those folks in the eastern woodlands. And so this is anywhere east of the Mississippi River, so quite a large area. And popular settlement areas over here were in valleys that were near rivers, along the shores of the Great Lakes, and all along the Atlantic coast. And so for food, these people would go fishing, they would gather plants, they would hunt, and there was a little bit of agriculture in the beginning, definitely acquired from Mesoamerica, and then more and more as time went on. One of the notable groups here are the Mississippians, and they were the best city builders north of the Rio Grande. This is a depiction of Cahokia, which is really their biggest town. You can still go visit it today, and it's known for those earthen mounds. They're like pyramids built out of the earth, as you can see here. Very large. The largest mound that they had was larger than the pyramids at Giza. So very large mounds. Some of those mounds were used for ceremonial purposes. Some very important people would be able to live at the top of some of them, and a lot of them were burial mounds. So you'd have things like one of those important people being buried in a large mound, and then oftentimes in that mound as well you would see other humans buried along with them. That would indicate that it was an important person. And then other mounds, there would just be like random bodies, buried in them, and you could kind of gauge from those mounds that those people might not have been seen as quite as important because there was no ceremony to their burial. So this Cahokia was the trading hub for the Mississippians. They did implement farming eventually. And so basically, the big thing about Cahokia is the mounds, and I do recommend Googling that. It's quite interesting. Moving right along. All right, the Great Plains and the Great Basin people. So these were nomadic groups that lived in the center of North America, in the center of what we think of as the United States. And they did not rely on farming very much because they were nomadic. So they traveled following food, seasonal plants, but also animals. And they retreated to valleys and mountains when it was a period of low rainfall. In about 1200 CE is when the people in these areas started working farming into their system a bit, and so they would have a central location where their crops were being grown, but that they would still travel seasonally to find plants and other animals, but eventually make their way back to home camp. These are groups that you see depicted in a lot of Western movies, heavily stereotyped. You see them with the, living in teepees. If you've never watched a Western, check one out. They will be in there for sure. We don't have a lot of resources, a lot of writing and documents and such from these people, and so we don't, as for all of them, but especially these groups. One thing about groups that were nomadic that's different from groups who practiced agriculture is the way they used religion. And so for groups that were growing crops and they were in large cities, because they were stationary, they tended to have a pantheon of gods, so actual gods that they could pray to for help, and they would worship those gods. However, with groups that were nomadic, they tended to believe more in nature spirits and practice shamanism, so really communicating with nature, and they didn't really have like set gods that they would pray to for individual help. It was more about being in tune with nature. So that's one major difference here. Okay, Pacific Northwest. These are groups in areas up near Washington and Oregon and Northern California, all along that very wet ocean coastline up there. And because they had so much water, there really was an abundance of animals, there were an abundance of plants, and so they really didn't need agriculture. And they had plenty of food and resources where they were. And so even though they didn't have people dedicated to agriculture, they still had a food surplus. And so they still had one of those complex societies and a stratified society, wealthier people, people that had leisure time to do things like art and crafting. Another thing that is notable about the Pacific Northwest is that they were very good at canoe building. And so they navigated water really well because they were so close and had so much water. And they're also known for having cedar houses. Those canoes, would be scraped out of usually cedar trees. I guess that's all I want to say about them. Well, by the 1400s, there are about 130,000 people there. So somewhat populous, but not huge, right? Not like some of those Mesoamerican groups. Okay. And our last group that I want to specifically talk about are the groups in the north. So groups who are living in freezing conditions. They survived on fishing and hunting, and because they lived in this, freezing environment, there really weren't very many plants. There were a couple groups that lived close enough to areas with plants that they could sort of collect some of them and add some plants to their diet, but most groups were hunting seals and whales. You do see the igloos we have here. That's something that some of them utilized, but I think, again, this culture is one of those heavily stereotyped groups in some of our movies that we see. So when we talk about the decline of some of these societies, they were already declining by the 1400s. However, that's not to say that they would have died out without European expansion. A lot of these groups that did start declining due to warfare and changes in temperature, there was a miniature ice age around this time. Some of them who survived that moved and reformed societies with different groups, and they were able to, again, increase their population. This was more difficult in the Southwest because those societies, because they were living in such a hot and dry environment, it was harder to start from scratch for them. So they had a harder time with the reforming. They changed in a few different ways. So, for example, the Mississippians, they were heavily stratified, and they changed more to an egalitarian society, meaning that society was not as stratified. People were a little more equal to each other. And then eventually these Mississippians matured into three groups that you may have heard of: the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw peoples. And those were all people that encountered Europeans when Europeans came over. In the Caribbean, one group I want to specifically point out, and this is a smaller specific group, those are the Taínos. And I want to talk about them because those are the people that encountered Christopher Columbus when he came over. And so the Taínos were a highly stratified society. There were nobility who did have jewels and gold, and they ruled over different islands and took tribute, meaning sort of like people paying rent to be protected by these chiefs and nobles. So right around the time when we think of European contact, right around 1500 or so, there were about 5 to 10 million people north of the Rio Grande. So that's an important number. 5 to 10 million, and then approximately 1 million in the Caribbean. And that's a lot of people. There were over 350 different societies with their own languages. And like I've kind of touched on, there were different variations. So some groups heavily were into agriculture and farming. Some groups were more nomadic, and so they hunted and gathered. And then some groups practiced both. Another variation, and this is not something I've talked about, is the matrilineal versus the patrilineal society. And that means whether the power follows the female line or the male line. So today in the United States, we still have a patrilineal society. So when you think of, whose last name you get, generally that follows the male line. Power is recently being restructured, and it's a slow evolution, but we're still heavily patrilineal. Some groups were matrilineal, so the power flowed through the females. And that was kind of rare, but it was still more significant than what we see today. We also have groups that were stratified, and we've talked about that, having different levels of society and different classes, or egalitarian, so people being more equal amongst each other. Religion, so this is something I talked about, hunting and gathering. Those people had, you know, a relationship with nature, with animals, with spirits. They didn't have specific gods, whereas people who were in one stationary spot practicing agriculture did rely on help from gods. Another thing about pre-contact Americas is that there was a lack of disease associated with the domestication of animals. And so in the Americas, people were not domesticating animals. So we didn't have people raising cattle for food. And because in Europe and in Africa, people did raise animals for food, there's a lot of disease associated with the close contact of those animals, which didn't exist in North America. And that does become a problem. Okay, here are our universal concepts that we went over. So subjugation. These are really good to know the definitions of. You will want to know these. You might want to hit pause and then take these down. Stratification and slavery. And so these concepts will come into play for when you're writing your final paper. You're going to pick one of these universal concepts. There are several more that we'll get into as the weeks go by, but you'll want to pick a universal concept that speaks to you. So start thinking about these concepts. If one of these sounds good to you, maybe start researching. And here's kind of a question just to keep in mind. So how was the subjugation and decimation of these different people that we've talked about justified by the Europeans that ended up coming over? Because as you know, we can tell from this two-part lecture, while we don't get to get into them heavily, you can tell that these groups are complex societies, right? They have technology, they have art, they have science, they have math. And so a lot of times when Europeans are talking about native groups, they dehumanize them, making them sound not as smart, not worthy of their land. And so how are they able to do that? How do you see that being justified? So just kind of keep that in mind. And then next week, our lecture will be about the European invasion of the Americas. So please take notes on these lectures. So if you need to go back and kind of write down some of the main points, please do so, because you will have a quiz at the end of this module, and a lot of this will be on the quiz. Again, if you have questions or anything, please email me, and I'll see you next time.